Let's hear from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. I think we have audio.
We have never sought war with North Korea, and still today, we do not seek it. If war does come, it will be because of continued acts of aggression like we witnessed yesterday. And if war comes, make no mistake, the North Korean regime will be utterly destroyed.
Rhetoric from Nikki Haley, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Frank, let me start with you since you're our host. This latest test, the latest in a long series of ballistic missile tests that we've all watched, does it change the state of play in a fundamental way? The fact that this missile now, we're all aware, can not only reach the West Coast, but the continental United States. Is this just a continuation of a new positioning from North Korea, or do you see something fundamentally different here?
Well, thank you, Todd. So you're right. The test that North Korea conducted earlier this week is the latest version of their ballistic missile. It was the Hwasong-15. It was a very large missile, had advanced second stage capability, and it can pretty much, the effective range was 8,000 miles, so that can cover all the United States. Now, I wouldn't call it necessarily a fundamental shift in a technical capability sense. We knew that this test was coming. They've conducted similar tests before in July, 2 ICBM tests. If there's a fundamental shift, I would say it could potentially be more in their political posture, because Kim Jong-un has said before that he wants to simultaneously develop the nuclear weapons program as well as the economy. And now with this test, he stated that North Korea has finalized the nuclear weapons force. So we may be looking for a shift in North Korea's regime towards more of economic development. We may even see a pivot to an opening and engagement.
One bit of speculation or analysis that I've heard is this dual track, right? Developing weapons, developing the economy, suggesting that Kim is looking for space now that he's proven he has this capability. Back off, leave me alone, let me restructure my economy without interference from the Americans or from the South Koreans, indeed. Do you buy that sort of strategic take?
That's what he said since he's implemented that. It's called the Pyeongjin line, the dual track development of the nuclear weapons and economy. He said that, I think, at least since 2013. We'll see. It remains to be seen in the upcoming months whether that policy will move forward now that he's secured his nuclear weapons.
One of the features of this show is input from people around the world and from listeners and viewers. So I want to play, I think this is a video clip now. This is coming from Ji-Hyun Hwang, who's a student at Hankook Academy of Foreign Relations in South Korea. Let's play this clip. This is probably in Korean, so for the benefit of some of you, I'm going to translate after a minute here.
네, 일단은 저는 트럼프 대통령이 가지고 있는 그러한
It says, I want to learn more about the specific ideologies that President Trump might have. Since the nuclear issue is a problem for the entire world, we must understand each country's policy. And then she asks if she has a message for President Trump, and her response is, please study the history. Using Twitter does not mean you are communicating with the people. Who wants to talk about Twitter? Anyone want to talk about
트위터를 한다고.
Glenn, I'm going to go to you. We'll talk about more of the substance, but I want you to talk about Twitter for a moment because this is a very new way of communicating on the world stage. Do you have a sense of how the North interprets Twitter messages from the president, whether insulting or bombastic? Do they ignore them? Is it just part of the background, or is it important?
No, they certainly talk about them. I was in Pyongyang last week talking to people in the Korean Workers' Party, and they talk about Trump's Twitter feed. But of course, being British, I'm also aware of some of his more recent endeavors on Twitter. So after that, one really wonders, having retweeted some of the most vile and material from the extreme neo-Nazi right in Britain, which is actually false videos, seems to be, it wouldn't encourage the North Koreans very much. I mean, his recent contribution this morning on Twitter with respect to North Korea was less than fully helpful in the sense that one's got to understand that for the North Koreans, like it or not, I mean, Kim Jong-un is almost a god. and if you're insulting him, it makes it very difficult to come to the table. They're quite willing to put up with, if you want, insults or threats of being wiped out. I mean, that's fine. They understand that, but actually going to the extent of, if you want, lèse-majesté, is a step too far. I mean, just imagine what would happen in Japan if you insulted the emperor, or we know what happens in Thailand if you insult the king. You get 20 years in jail.
Who's reading Twitter in North Korea? Is it just a small handful of elites?
Oh yeah. I mean, the people who matter at the top, they get a daily, they get an equivalent of reference news, which is a daily compilation of world news, which clearly, even if they're not seeing Twitter itself, it's being covered. I mean, part of the problem is that they have all the information, but they don't understand what it means necessarily. I mean, they can talk about local election results in France or whatever, but not necessarily capable of understanding. And one of the problems they have with the United States, it's a very different system from their own, and they don't understand checks and balances, and they don't understand that people in the same administration are actually saying different things at the same time.
Jean-Lee, let me go to you and talk a little bit more deeply about American strategy. It's clear, or it seems clear, that the Trump administration has abandoned strategic patience, the doctrine of the Obama administration before it. Or have they? I mean, they've gone to great lengths to rhetorically abandon strategic patience. But have you noticed a substantive difference, a substantive shift in strategy or even tactics, aside from the Twitter feed, from this administration than from the one or the two before it?
Well, let's talk about that Twitter feed. I will answer that question.
Go right ahead.
Because one of the differences we're seeing in terms of Obama-era policy and strategic patience versus the Trump Twitter feed is the rhetoric. And the rhetoric coming from the Twitter feed is not only confusing to the North Koreans, also confusing to the South Koreans, because it doesn't jive with the policy that his Secretary of State is putting out there when it comes to dealing with North Korea. The rhetoric, part of the strategy of strategic patience was, it's kind of like when you have a naughty child. There's a theory that perhaps you shouldn't give that child the attention that child is craving, right? Put it in the naughty corner. But part of that policy was to kind of ignore the provocations and not to kind of feed it. But what we're getting with these really crazy tweets from the president's feed is a rise in this war of words between North Korea and the United States. And certainly what I think people in South Korea are worried about is if both of these leaders raise the rhetoric to the point where they can't back down, is that going to lead the region into some sort of a conflict? So it's very confusing for people in South Korea, I have to say, not to mention those of us here in the US and the North Koreans. I have to remind you that we have a state of an armistice and a ceasefire in place on the Korean Peninsula. So militarily, we're limited to a certain degree if we abide by that armistice. North Korea knows that and is really trying to push things just up to the limit. But Donald Trump, the president, can threaten all he wants in his rhetoric, but there is a limit to a certain degree, if you're going to follow the code of conduct, to what you can do in terms of military action. Of course, they can go ahead and do it, but there is an armistice or a ceasefire that has been in place since 1953, so it's something to keep in mind.
We're going to talk a little bit more about military options, such as they are, a little bit later in the program. Anthony Ruggiero, sticking on the Twitter theme for one moment, another feature of the president's Twitter feed when it comes to the North is pushing the Chinese and sometimes encouraging them, sometimes praising them, sometimes insulting them as well, trying to get them to ratchet up and crack down on their client state, North Korea, somewhat of a client. Is that effective, not just on Twitter, but maybe using real diplomacy? How far has the Trump administration gotten with their calls to the Chinese government to get tough on North Korea from their end?
Right. You know, when you ask the question about comparing the Trump administration policy and the Obama administration policy of strategic patience, you know, the relationship with China, I think, is the biggest example of the difference. I mean, this is the first administration that has really gone after China with sanctions for their facilitation of North Korea's sanctions evasion. You know, there are many times they've gone after one Chinese bank. They've gone after numerous Chinese nationals. I think, the interesting part, to your point about public talking about how she and Trump have a close relationship, but it's clear in private that there's a tough message being delivered, because for the Trump's trip to Beijing, he was very public in his praise for President Xi, and then only a few weeks later he comes back and there are strong sanctions against Chinese entities. I would also come back, if I can come back for a second, back to the question of, does this missile test mean now we're moving forward on diplomacy, or is this a sign? I have to caution, first of all, that we saw larger missile systems in the April parade. So this is not the end of North Korea's missile program. It's not the end of North Korea's dangerous missile program. There are probably larger missiles that they're working on now. And I remember, it was only Monday, the day before the test, where people were saying that this 70-day pause in testing was an opportunity for negotiations. And that's not true. What we now learned is that North Korea was using that 70-day window to build a lot bigger missile to reach the United States. So I think we have to be very careful about suggesting that the North Koreans are going to all of a sudden throw up their hands and say, okay, now let's have a negotiation. They're only going to want it on their terms, and it's not going to be on denuclearization terms.
What's changed is that, at least after this missile test, the North Koreans, or Kim Jong-un, has actually said they're at the end of their program. Now, in a sense, if they retest in the near future, that's a loss of faith for him. He said it's complete. So it seems to me that we're in a much better position than we've been in the past. I have to say, Barack Obama described his policy as strategic patience, and I term it malign neglect. The sanctions were on and they were squeezing North Korea. So it wasn't a benign operation by any means. I think the key thing to realize is that the administration completely misunderstands China's influence. Because frankly, on the economy, China has some ability to hurt North Korea, but of course it doesn't want to collapse the state. The last thing it wants is US troops on the southern bank of the Yellow River. Political terms,
or North Korean refugees pouring into China.
Well, I'm pouring into South Korea. There'll be 10 million in South Korea and 2 million in China. So, the people who've got the big problem are in the South. But the point being that China's got almost no political influence over North Korea. They refused the foreign minister who wanted to come about 6 weeks ago. So this notion that some people still have, that sort of the North Korean Workers' Party is some kind of subsidiary of the Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, is complete nonsense. And the sooner people learn that, the better, because at the moment he's pushing on a lever with no fulcrum.
All right, I do want to stick on China for the next part of our discussion, but Jean, you wanted to add something about missiles.
I just wanted to mention that I read the statement about completion of the testing or the program a little bit differently. I read them as saying that we've begun the final process of completing this nuclear weaponry, which I read to mean that actually they acknowledge that they have a couple more tests they may need to conduct. So I think we can't relax quite yet. And I think that experts might agree that they have to master re-entry. So there are a couple different components before they actually have a weapon system that can truly threaten us. That said, I think every single test is very dangerous for other reasons. But I think that we should keep in mind, too, that it might be some political posturing. Kim Jong-un did say on January 1st, on New Year's Day, he said, I'm going to complete this by the end of the year. So he had to show his people that he had this timeline and he was going to complete it. And also, I just want to point out, I had expected a test. I know everybody was saying, what is up with this 75-day lull? But I had been expecting one in December, because the times that I've been in North Korea in December under Kim Jong-un, this has been a time for testing, because December is the month that his father, Kim Jong-il, passed away. So there are a couple different domestic reasons for why Kim Jong-un wanted to test this missile.
What better way to honor your relatives? Yeah. Frank, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so China doesn't have as much political influence on North Korea as people say, but they do have the leverage. And so it's just basically a reiteration of Anthony's point that China has increased the enforcement of their sanctions, and we're seeing that a lot over the last 6 to 8 months.
Now, that's good, because I do want to stay with China, because we have another contributor from China. This is Yita Wang, an office worker in Shanghai. She has this message for President Trump. Let's watch the clip, and I'm going to use my abilities for translation yet again.
向我们的习主席学习吧，一带一路 丝绸之路和平发展。
He says, learn from our President Xi. Things like One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road, peaceful development, shared prosperity. Being the only powerful country isn't fun. Look at China and Russia. We're on great terms. Why do you have to do what you've been doing? Everyone should participate. You should not dominate the game all by yourself. I think that most Chinese people share this view.
我觉得中国老百姓大部分都是这样认为的。
Anthony, President Trump may agree with Yitao Yang here. Here, the U.S. has been trying to deal China further into this process, right, than probably many officials in China want. China is split on how far to go in pushing on the North Koreans. Isn't that right, when you look at the Chinese options for sanctions?
Well, the Chinese leadership faces a difficult decision. The North Koreans, they learned in 2005 when the United States sanctioned Banco Delta Asia, Bank of Macau, that they should not have all of their operations in one place. And so while they do have a majority of their operations in one country, it's diverse. And the question for the Chinese leadership is, how long are they going to look the other way? And I think that I agree with what the other panelists have said, is that China has very little political leverage. But with the amount of trade that they have with North Korea, it's hard to claim, as the Chinese continue to do, that they have really no leverage with North Korea. It's clear that they have leverage with North Korea. I mean, the issue here is really going to come down to the United States is going to have to use its own sanctions against China to get them to act. And we don't have a lot of examples of it because, as I said, there haven't been a lot of examples of the U.S. sanctioning China. But in some of the cases where the U.S. has acted first, the Chinese have followed that with investigations and looking into the activities. And we're going to have to see more of that. I don't think the Chinese are ready to do that on their own nationals, but we have to get to that point.
I'm going to take this opportunity to own and trademark the phrase domino sanctions. That's what you're talking about, is us leaning on China with sanctions so that China turns around and leans on the North.
Right. I mean, the issue here is that the Chinese are willing to, as I like to say, nibble around the edges a little bit and target North Koreans that are engaged in these activities. And certainly there are North Koreans engaged in these activities. I don't want to suggest there are not, but there are far more Chinese companies and nationals and banks that are engaged in this activity with North Korea. And the question we all have to ask ourselves is, the UN is not going to, Chinese are not going to allow the UN to sanction Chinese persons. So it's really left to the United States. And, just a part of history, since I worked on Iran sanctions as well, is exactly what we did on Iran sanctions. I mean, the United States, a majority of the sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table were not UN sanctions. They were US sanctions that were implemented by the United States and a group of like-minded countries. And that's probably what it's going to come down to with North Korea. And the question is going to be, is China going to be the one that's sanctioned, or are they going to be the one that help implement those sanctions?
Well, sanctions are...
What's the purpose of sanctions? Because they're not stopping North Korea developing nuclear weapons. And there's no prospect that the sanctions that you've got now will actually stop that process happening. So what are they there for?
Well, I mean, I've written extensively on this since I've left the U.S. government. It's pretty clear, if you look at the numbers, just even back to February 2016, looking at U.S. sanctions alone, North Korea was 8th in country sanctions programs. And that was before, it had done numerous nuclear tests and missile tests. It was behind such, large threats to the United States as Zimbabwe and the Balkans, and other countries that certainly were not as much of a threat to the United States as North Korea was at that time.
I mean, I understand the argument for sanctions, but the sanctions were supposed to stop North Korea becoming a nuclear weapons power capable of hitting the United States. Now, it's very clear that the sanctions you have now will not stop that happening. I mean, the CIA assessment says they have the capability of hitting the United States with a nuclear weapon within 3 months. Now, you really think sanctions are going to work in the next 8 weeks?
Well, I mean, that's your opinion. I would say the goal of sanctions is denuclearization of North Korea through negotiations. And I will also use the Iran example again. I remember very clearly that people said that Iran would never return to the negotiating table. They said that you could never go after Iran's oil revenue. That would be a third rail, and other things like that. The North Koreans have not yet felt what it is like to have the United States government use Iran-style sanctions on them. And you know who knows that? The Chinese know that. And so I think the clear issue here is, will the North Korean regime, the elites, the military, and the weapons programs be able to continue to get revenue when Chinese banks are sanctioned and they're not able to process those transactions for them?
All right, so Anthony, you're making the argument, and I'm glad you did, because I was going to ask you about this anyway, that there is a lot of room left to squeeze, that the sanctions are not nearly done if we want to ratchet them down more. We're coming up on a break soon, and this gives me an opportunity, because sanctions are a two-way street. You can be the sanctioner, but the sanctionee is part of this equation as well. And I'd like to get maybe a minute or 90 seconds from each of you, and we can go down the line. Glenn, we can start with you. What you think North Korea wants from this entire confrontation? Do they want out from under sanctions? Do they want room to rebuild the economy? Do they just want to be tough? So start there. What do they want?
Regime survival. And they see two elements to regime survival. Firstly, they need a nuclear deterrent. They're not capable of competing with the United States on conventional weapons. They're outspent by a factor of 50 with the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And then they want to develop the economy. They have to develop the economy so the people that matter, the 2 billion people in Pyongyang, actually see rising standards of living, and preferably the rest of the country as well, but they're the key people. So that's what it's about, regime survival.
You agree? Right?
I do, and I don't have anything to add on that point, but I do want to reiterate that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that there's no amount of pressure that would get Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons. Senator Corker admitted as much in a Meet the Press interview a couple months ago. So I think the question is, and advocates of sanctions will say that we now have a tougher set of sanctions right now, but it takes a certain amount of time, 3 years, 4 years, and that may be the case. The question is, do we have the time to wait for the sanctions to kick in?
I would agree. We don't have time. It takes a couple years before sanctions really, truly bite. Of course, a lot of that is enforcement of sanctions, and it'll take some time to make sure that all the countries are enforcing them. I do think, and I can tell you I was there, I was in North Korea earlier this year, and the people that I worked with were very concerned about a fuel embargo from China. And so that is one area, and I can guarantee you that the U.S. mission to the United Nations is working on trying to convince their partners on the UN Security Council to agree to that. That will affect the daily lives of.
Frank, I have a feeling that you would agree that a fuel embargo would probably go a long way, and a more complete embargo on North Korea, since you're looking for Iran-style sanctions. But what do you think the North wants from this entire confrontation?
Sure. I mean, I think North Korea wants a unified Korean peninsula under the rule of the North Korean regime. I think that's pretty much their long-term goal. I think, just broadly on sanctions, I'm sure we'll discuss this later, but I'd be very interested to hear the other alternatives, because to me, with a country that has violated almost every negotiated settlement that we've had with them, and I'm not advocating for sanctions on its own, that I'm interested in what the other panelists, I'm sure we'll get into it later, see as an alternative to sanctions. Sanctions only take as long as we are willing to implement them. I think the Trump administration has made significant strides over the last 10 months. But I think that the intelligence assessment is interesting, but perhaps we'll see what happens moving forward.
Before we come right up on the break, which is in just a minute, I want to do host prerogative again. Frank, since you're our host, get you to talk about your neighbors a little bit. We're right across the street from the State Department here in Foggy Bottom. There's some Rex Tillerson news happening. Nobody's noticed because there's so much else going on in Washington today. It would appear in Trump administration fashion that the Secretary of State is on the way out. When you look at American diplomacy with the South, with China, with North Korea, such as it is, even though the president said Rex Tillerson was wasting his time trying to talk to the North Koreans, Is this shakeup that we're in for disruptive, or does it not matter at all?
Well, it's hard to comment on something that hasn't happened yet, but I would say that, so one of the issues with the current policy is that I think the Trump administration has been very clear about what they're trying to do. They're trying to maximize pressure against North Korea. They want to isolate North Korea. They want to cut it off from the international financial system. That part is very clear. I think what's not clear is, and very muddled, is how they message their openness to engagement. So, for example, President Trump will say that he's willing to meet with Kim Jong-un and have talks, and then later he'll tweet that talks are a waste of time. And I think also in between what President Trump says and what his senior officials say, there hasn't been a lot of consistency. So I think if you have a new Secretary of State, I think the name out there right now is the CIA Director, Mike Pompeo. If he's more aligned with President Trump, at least you'll have some better consistency in the messaging.
In the messaging, if he's more aligned with President Trump, does that mean more actual pressure? Is there anything practical that goes on in the diplomacy end if you get rid of this sort of separation of vision between Tillerson and Trump that we've been told exists? If they become more aligned, what happens?
Well, I think, so the way President Trump articulated the strategy initially back in May after the review was that it was a strategy of maximum pressure and engagement. But I feel like the engagement part sort of fell off and people didn't understand what engagement meant because there didn't seem to be any efforts at engagement. But how I interpret engagement from the administration is that they're engaging diplomatically to put pressure on other countries to enforce sanctions. So that's one definition of engagement.
That's not engagement, that's non-engagement.
I think that's probably one plausible way that they're defining it, and that would be consistent with Trump's message.
All right, we're gonna take a short break now so everybody can take a sip of water and we can reset. And when we come back, we're gonna talk about whether this whole situation actually has us closer to nuclear war, which is really the question behind all of this, whether it's likely or not. And we're also going to hear from some people who've been through it. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for, you're all getting settled there. Welcome back. It's good to have you all with us. It's been 72 years since the world has seen the destruction caused by nuclear weapons. Most people have no real sense of what a nuclear bomb means, but Terumi Tanaka does have a sense. He was 13 years old and living in Nagasaki when the United States dropped the atomic bomb on his city. He lived about 2 miles from ground zero and somehow survived, even though the bomb devastated his neighborhood. That's just amazing. 2 days later, he and his mother visited the epicenter searching for their family members who live nearby. Here's how he described the scene. This clip is in Japanese, so I'm going to translate this one as well. He says houses were gone. Only the steel bars of concrete buildings stood bare and hollow. Steel bars of factories were entirely bent. Everything else was a burnt field. On the way to my aunt's house, we saw blackened bodies all over the place, probably burned underneath houses that burned down. People who died from severe injuries and burns, they were left on the ground without being collected. Those who were gravely injured and alive were left to writhe in pain without rescue. Today, Mr. Tanaka is a nuclear engineer himself, and he's an activist against nuclear weapons. And as he told us, he feels things are going in the wrong direction. Well, he says further there, it's especially disconcerting that the current Japanese government is actively feeding the military threat. The United States and Japan claim that North Korea is provoking, but the United States has come all the way over to do military exercise in close proximity to North Korea. So it appears to me, rather, that it's the United States that is provoking more. I want the United States to stop provoking. Instead, work to create the conditions to make dialogue possible. Glenn Ford, I think that a lot of people in Japan might feel differently from Mr. Tanaka there. They've seen North Korean missiles flying over their territory. There have been air raid drills.
Where else could they go?
Where else? Well, let me get the question out, and then I want you to answer. People in Japan have seen North Korean missile tests flying over their territory, right? They've had air raid sirens going off in exercises. What do you make of what Mr. Tanaka has to say about...
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with Mr. Tanaka. I mean, why have they got air raid sirens going off? It's because Abe wants to get rid of Article 9 of the Constitution. And the only way to do that is to frighten the Japanese people, which is why Japan is not interested in a settlement of the North Korean situation, because that means he'd lose his referendum. Even with the North Korean threat, the latest opinion polls put him 6% behind, and he's going to call a referendum. So Japan's interest is to actually make every phone ring every time there's a North Korean missile within 1,000 miles. So, and if you want to launch a medium-range missile, there's no other direction to go.
So you think that the government in Japan has a stake in alarmism here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones that wrecked the six-party talks. I mean, I understand. I have a great deal of sympathy with the issue of the abductees. But because of the abductee issue, they refused to agree anything, which is why the North Koreans walked away, and why the North Koreans have refused consistently to go back to the six-party talks, because they weren't a venue that was going to get anywhere.
Frank, is the experience in Japan with American nuclear weapons as part of their culture now, obviously? Does that experience and the nightmare of it feed into the modern Japanese approach to North Korea and the potential threat that they represent?
Well, I think the threat has always been there. So North Korea has had nuclear weapons for at least 10 years, since 2006. So the nuclear shadow has been there over South Korea, it's been there over Japan. And now with the long-range tests, it's growing appreciably in the United States. But I would add that, it's one thing to have the capability, it doesn't mean they're going to use it. And so I think North Korea is not suicidal. They know that if they were to ever attack the United States or its allies, that we would respond with overwhelming force, and that means the destruction of the country. I think really the concern is that sometimes we tend to nitpick North Korea's tests. So we'll say, oh, they didn't achieve this, they didn't demonstrate a reentry vehicle. And so what North Korea may do is that they want to prove beyond any doubt that they have this capability. So the concern is that they would demonstrate a missile test with a live warhead that does an atmospheric detonation over international waters, and that would be a game changer for us. I think another concern for us is that North Korea may now mistakenly believe that they have a nuclear weapon capability, so they can keep the U.S. aside, and they can run amok and coerce South Korea and do a lot of provocations for their purposes.
Well, we started with Japan, and let's go to South Korea now, because we have another contributor that I want to help drive our discussion here. This is Yonsei. This is Yoon-jae Kim from the Yonsei University in Seoul, who has a clip here, and I'm going to translate this one as well. Oh, good. I don't have to translate this one. I can give my
translate into Korean.
Give my Korean a rest. Yes.
Or Japanese.
Well, I guess the first thing that I would like to know is, why is the U.S. so afraid of North Korea? Like, North Korea has a very tiny army. Even if it gets ICBMs, which it is working its way towards, like, North America still has a qualitative and quantitative military edge, both in conventional and nuclear capabilities. And so the North Koreans know that if they do anything, that if this escalates to an actual conflict with America, I mean, they will just definitively lose. So why is the U.S. making such a big deal of North Korea?
Jean Lee, we've had a lot of analysts and experts and journalists, maybe even you, on The Takeaway, on my show, explaining that South Koreans tend to be much less excited about the North Korean threat than Americans are. Is that true?
It is true to a certain degree. I mean, South Koreans have been living with this threat for decades now, and they have to go about their daily lives. Remember that they are living in a country that is extremely competitive. They have everyday concerns that they're much more concerned about. I remember as a child when I was visiting South Korea, we used to have these regular civil air raid drills. I think they're at 2 p.m. and you have to pull your car over to the side of the road, take cover. Frankly, I think people don't even stop what they're doing right now. They're so oblivious to some of these threats from North Korea. That said, things are a little bit different right now. I think the uncertainty and the lack of clarity in terms of what President Trump might do has unnerved some South Koreans. And also what's interesting is there's a growing call in South Korea among some parts of the population for South Korea to arm itself. I think it's kind of reflected in what the student was saying. Some people are calling for to have nuclear weapons reintroduced to the Korean Peninsula. So this is a really interesting development that I see happening in South Korea.
Frank, you have experience in the diplomatic world, and we're talking about the potential for military confrontations and how these societies view the threat culturally. You've been around the negotiating table. How does the actual threat of violence, the actual threat of war, if there is such a threat, really inform how these discussions? You were at the six-party talks; those are defunct. There may be talks in the future. How does that inform how talks proceed?
Well, this is really the debate over whether we could have a policy of deterrence. I think the student's question is a good one. I think Frank mentioned this as well, that, of course, North Korea is not suicidal. I don't think any of us think that. I think that North Korea sees its ICBMs and nuclear weapons programs as a way to prevent the United States from coming to South Korea's aid, and probably protecting Japan as well. And so the question here that, one that I think people have been struggling with is can you deter North Korea? Can we, a possible policy solution, can it just be, let's just not give them all this credit and attention for these provocations, and let's just say, you do whatever you want inside, but you can't attack the United States or South Korea, Japan. I would say, of course, we can deter North Korea from those military strikes, but the problem with that as a policy, and that gets to the student's question, is you can't really use that as a policy to deter North Korea from proliferation. For example, North Korea built a nuclear reactor in Syria that was destroyed by Israel in 2007. If our policy is similar to strategic patience and just saying, let's not worry about this, we can of course deter North Korea, let's focus on something else, especially something else with China, right? Then are we prepared to have a North Korea nuclear weapons program and an ICBM program that it will sell to anyone who is willing to pay for that? And that's really the crux of the policy debate with North Korea, which is you can have deterrence as an element of that policy, but what is the other part of that policy? And that's where I think we get into the debate of sanctions versus diplomacy. I just want to make one last point, is that a couple of times panelists up here have noted, it seems like the U.S. and Japan are not interested in settling. It's interesting that question really needs to be on the other side. Is North Korea really interested in settling? I mean, Ambassador Jo Yoon, who's the special representative for North Korea policy for the U.S., has been trying, I think, to get the North Koreans to respond. And his latest response said there's no signal from North Korea. So if you want to have negotiations, as they say, it takes two to tango, right? And if the North Koreans are not interested in negotiations, where does that leave us? We can't just, show up to Beijing in the Daitai State House where the six-party talks were before and sit at the plenary table and say, okay, we're ready for six-party talks. It doesn't work that way. So the North Koreans have shown no interest in denuclearization talks.
Well, I think they haven't responded. That doesn't mean that they're not interested. I think they eventually do want to get to the negotiating table, but they're doing it on their own timeline. They want to get their nuclear weapons program to a point where they can sit at the table as peers, or that's what they're thinking.
Right. I mean, I guess I would say that's the danger there.
Yep.
I mean, I think Madam Che was very clear in Russia that she sees this, or North Korea sees this, as an arms control negotiation, as a discussion amongst nuclear peers, with North Korea replacing the USSR in those negotiations. And that is plainly unacceptable for the United States. I would argue it should be unacceptable for everyone, that we would suggest that we would accept North Korea as a nuclear power as an end goal. That's not naive suggesting they don't have nuclear weapons now. Of course they have nuclear weapons now. But I think we have to think of, North Korea experts have this, most of us have this flaw of, thinking about it in silos. If we accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, the Iranian regime will stand up and say, of course, let's renegotiate that nuclear deal. And you know what I want? I want the North Korea deal. I want the deal where I, in Tehran, can get a nuclear weapon. So we have to be careful about the precedents that we're willing to set here with regard to global nonproliferation.
One moment. In just a few minutes, I want to tell our audience here at the Institute for Peace, we're going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. That's coming up in about 10 or 12 minutes. And I'm telling you now so that you can get the juices flowing, start to think about your questions. You know all of the different areas of expertise that these panelists are bringing to bear. So start to think about your questions, because in a few minutes, the mic is going out into the audience. So I leave you with that. Glenn, go right ahead.
You're saying you shouldn't set a precedent with North Korea, but you've set a precedent with Israel, you've set a precedent with India, you've set a precedent with Pakistan. I mean, the world's most proliferators were the Pakistanis, with A.Q. Khan hawking his gas centrifuges around the world. Where were the sanctions against Pakistan? Where were the threats to Pakistan? Where were the negotiations? No, it was fine. That was fine. North Korea, oh no, they're a big problem. So I mean, from the North Korea perspective, it's the U.S. It's not being, it's changing the rules of the game halfway through.
Frank, you're the one around this table who's worked at the Pentagon, and you don't have a uniform on, but you've worked over there. The other inevitable part of this discussion is military action from the United States and its allies. I had Admiral Mike Mullen on our show a couple of months ago, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I asked him if, when he looks at the big map and looks at the military options inside the Pentagon, as they relate to North Korea, if any of those options are good. He said none of them were good. That was his short answer. There was a longer one, but I think that you probably have some thoughts on viable military options, if any really exist. Is there anything the United States can do, failing diplomacy here, to really brush back the North Korean nuclear and missile program?
Well, I'm not going to object to what Admiral Mullen said. That's my first point. There's certainly military options. I wouldn't call them viable military options, because they all entail significant loss of life. So there's a recent Congressional Research Service study that came out that said even in a conventional conflict, within the first few days, you would have anywhere from 30,000 to 300,000 deaths. And then obviously those numbers go up exponentially when you have nuclear weapons involved. So that being said, there's other things you can do militarily that may not be escalatory enough that would put us in a conflict. It's hard to think a lot of what those are, because I think if you have a kinetic action that strikes even, say, one missile facility, you know that North Korea will respond, because based on history, when they're pressured, they don't wilt. They certainly persevere. They almost always fight back and retaliate.
Right. I mean, it sounds strange, and it sounded strange to me the first time I read about this, that there is a language of military. You call it kinetic action. I like that phrase they use over at the Pentagon. You have the option of a devastating strike that hits Pyongyang, or you can send 2 cruise missiles to one site, and those two things say different things to the victim, right? Just a pinprick strike says, we're not going to wipe you out, we're just sending a message, so interpret that as message sent. Did that type of language work with the North Koreans?
Firstly, the North Koreans have to interpret what's happening, and there is a danger that they misinterpret what's actually happening. That's the first problem, because they're acutely aware from studying the Iraq War and the rest that they literally have minutes to make a decision. So let's hope that they appreciate the distinction between 2 missiles landing somewhere and a fully fledged assault. So that's the first problem you actually face. And secondly, there are talks about pinprick strikes. There's talk about if you want shooting down a missile in flight. You might get away with that because Kim Jong-un can actually say that was a missile failure. You strike or disappearing a submarine, fine, or hitting a TEL on the ground. I mean, he's not going to survive very long with his own administration. This is not a man on his own. His military agree with what he's doing as well. So, I mean, he's not going to survive if he doesn't fight back.
How about bringing down a computer network with some very creative worms and viruses? I think I've seen that before.
I mean, hang on. I mean, the US is doing that. I mean, why do you think the missiles are failing? I mean, the North Koreans woke up to that and rewired their whole missile systems or whatever, and they started to work. So, I mean, they also read the newspapers about what the Israelis and the Americans were doing in Iran. So, fine. I mean, that's going on. I think that would work, but it's not a very computer-oriented society. It's not quite like it's not quite like the States or Europe. They can get by without computers probably better than anybody else can.
Gene, let's get back to kinetics for a second, because the United States has thousands of troops in South Korea, huddled on a couple of bases, as I understand it, within range of North Korean artillery. So we have to think 2 or 3 times about the ramifications of even a pinprick strike.
The United States has 28,000 troops in South Korea, and in the region, 80,000 troops, and we have 200,000 Americans in that part of the world. So there are huge risks to any kind of kinetic action. I don't even know what kinetic action means, but there are huge risks to any kind of action that could spark or trigger military conflict, not just to the Korean people or the Japanese, but to Americans as well. I think when I hear the words military options, and we do hear the president threatening in very vague terms that he's going to do something, he's going to handle it, but to me, military options usually means the Americans are going to remind North Korea that they have some powerful tools in the regions, a powerful force in the region, nuclear-operated weaponry that they could unleash if they wanted to. And also remember that they carry out joint military drills, exercises twice a year with South Korea. The North Koreans see this as provocative, and they consider it a rehearsal for an invasion. I think this is something that's really dangerous right now, because we have, just to remind you that there's a Winter Olympics coming up in South Korea in February, so this is something certainly on the mind of the South Koreans. The Americans and the South Koreans have a joint military exercise that's going to overlap with part of the Olympics and the Paralympics, and so this is a huge concern as well, because that's always the start of this cycle of tension on the Korean Peninsula. So but that's also another sort of military option, is these joint military exercises. Not sure I answered your question, but I just
you did after a fashion, because I know the whole idea of kinetics is weird to you, and it is to me a little bit too. Let me go to one more video clip. This one is from Shanghai, from an office worker in Shanghai, China, who asked not to be identified. I'm not sure if I'm translating this one or if it's translated, but I guess we'll find out.
This is wondering, if U.S. would ever consult South Korea or solicit help from South Korea or China, and what if they don't help or they don't want to be engaged? What would U.S. proceed?
Jean,
That's interesting.
she wants to know if the U.S. would engage help with South Korea or with China. It's actually a good question. Former Ambassador Chris Hill was on our show just the other day, former ambassador, leader of the Six-Party Talks, where you were, Anthony. He said that one of the motivations he saw on the part of the North right now is to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, that these increasingly sophisticated missile tests are designed to divide the United States away from its allied relationship with the South. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. One of the major concerns in Seoul right now is something they call Korea passing. It's a little bit of a Konglish phrase, but it's the concern or fear that they're being bypassed and that the U.S. and North Korea are in the middle of some sort of move toward bilateral discussions that won't involve South Korea. South Korea wants to be part of this discussion. They are really the ones whose lives are at stake here. So they're desperately trying to make sure that they are at that table and at part of those discussions. We've got kind of an ideological difference between the current president of South Korea and the president of the United States. The president of South Korea comes from his parents were born in North Korea, so they were refugees from North Korea. He has a much more of a holistic, I think, sense of the Korean Peninsula. He's concerned about the future of the North Korean people as well. So he doesn't want the obliteration of either South Korea or North Korea. It's a little bit at odds, I think. Of course, right now he is very angry about the provocations, especially with the Olympics coming up. So he is trying to be tough, but he does eventually want engagement. So there's a little bit of a difference in policy and approach between the U.S. and South Korea, but he also wants to be at those discussions. Does not want North Korea to create a situation where the North Koreans are only talking to the United States, or the United States is only talking to North Korea and not including Seoul.
Anthony, do you see the United States vulnerable to a play, if you like, from Pyongyang to divide us away from our allies, from the South Koreans?
Well, I guess that's the part that surprises me the most. I would say that Kim Jong-il was very good at doing that, and very strategic, his father, very strategic in getting incentives for giving up his programs. And of course, we all know that he didn't give up his programs. That's pretty obvious. I was surprised with the election of South Korean President Moon Jae-in that Kim Jong-un didn't make an overture towards South Korea to divide South Korea from the United States. It doesn't seem like that has happened yet. Certainly could be something that he winds up doing. I think that, unfortunately, I think Jean's right, that of course she's right, that Moon Jae-in would prefer to have a different North Korea policy than he has currently. His North Korea policy, I think in his view, unfortunately is aligned with the tougher policy that the United States wants now, whether it's deploying THAAD or making statements about stronger sanctions. I think he would much prefer talks about reopening Kaesong Industrial Complex, the North-South industrial complex, and we can talk about how that violates sanctions, but that's for another day. I think we'd much prefer, a trip to Pyongyang and a conversation and talking about the Olympics and having, ceremonies associated with that. But he can't do any of that. That's what he ran on, and he cannot do that. That's what surprises me, that Kim Jong-un has not taken that opportunity, having that administration in South Korea, to really drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. He hasn't done it yet, but maybe he will.
Frank, is Kim aware that the United States does not have an ambassador in Seoul right now? Because he might have an opening here if he wants to sow this kind of dissension that he has an opportunity to sow. We don't have a top person there.
Right. We don't have an ambassador to South Korea. I do think that point is maybe a little bit exaggerated, because we have definitely a strong cohort of career officials at the State Department that do their jobs very well. But it reflects concern amongst people in South Korea and in the region about the lack of attention given to diplomacy.
I don't think you're short of people giving sensible advice in South Korea. You've got General Vincent Brooks, who I think is an exceptionally good man So I wouldn't worry too much about whether Victor Chao's going to arrive in Seoul any day soon. I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, I think what's interesting, of course, is clearly Kim Jong-un is not trying to divide, if you want, South Korea from the United States, because he's not made the kind of offers that you'd expect him to make. So clearly that's not one of his aims.
What would you expect him to do if that were one of his aims? What would be his best play now if he were trying to drive that wedge, which a lot of people expect?
I mean, I don't think he's terribly interested at the moment. I mean, he was probably interested back in July when he thought that there could be a difference, but then Moon Jae-in made the decision that he couldn't afford to be further than lips and teeth away from Trump, because the danger was that South Korea was going to be left out of the decision-making loop, and that was going to be bad news for South Korea. And I fully agree that, I mean, the South Koreans don't trust President Trump. So in the short term, they're going to cleave to him as closely as possible. In the medium term, they're seriously talking not about US nuclear weapons, but they're developing their own nuclear deterrent, because they don't trust the United States, and maybe rightly, to actually trade Washington for Seoul. So on that basis, they're going to be looking after their own interests. So the one thing we might see out of this is if South Korea goes nuclear, Japan will follow within 15 minutes.
Very quickly.
And we're going to get a whole new environment there. But I think that's what the situation is. The North Koreans realize that to resolve their dilemma, they have to talk to the United States. Nobody else really matters in the end. So that's the solution. There's a bit of peripheral work with the South, with the people who are going to be paying the bills, because Donald Trump was not going to ask Congress to pay any bills for North Korea, and even if he did, he wouldn't get it. So it's going to be the South Koreans doing the heavy lifting, with maybe some assistance from China, European Union, and possibly, it depends how long it takes, Japan.
All right. Just 1 or 2 minutes left before we go to our final break and then on to questions from our distinguished audience here. We've talked a lot about sticks. We've talked a lot about sanctions. We've talked a lot about ratcheting down. Let's give a moment of lip service to carrots, shall we? Anthony, you're the sanctions man. Talk about carrots for a moment. It may only take you a minute. What positive motivation do we have to offer the North right now, and should we?
Well, sure. I mean, I am probably the rare person that talks about sanctions that thinks we should be talking to North Korea directly. Now, I distinguish between talks and negotiations. I think that it's valuable to talk to North Korea directly. I'm going to avoid listing out carrots, because I would say my criticism of our negotiation strategy is that we would negotiate for both sides. In other words, we determine what we want from North Korea, denuclearization, how we get to that point, and then we determine, what we're going to tell North Korea we're willing to give them in order to achieve that goal. It's North Korea that should tell us what they need from us in a negotiated settlement. We shouldn't be coming to the table with a list of, here are the number of sanctions we can release, here's the amount of heavy fuel oil we could give you. These are just past incentives that we've given them. And I would just say, my final point will be, that is the one area that we're not talking a lot about. What would be the negotiation strategy in a renewed six-party talks? Because remember, 2005 six-party talks joint statement says no nuclear program, no nuclear weapons for North Korea. That's certainly not what the Iran deal negotiated, right? So we'd have to discuss that. And then we have to think about how do we flip it on its head and get North Korea to commit to denuclearization up front. The flaw in the negotiations in the 2000s and in the 1990s was that we accepted this long drawn-out negotiations that in the end did not lead us to denuclearization.
Anthony, I think there might be a book in your future on the fine art of making deals. I think there's a market for that.
I think that one
might be written, Art of the Deal?
I'll look
Has it? I wasn't sure. Jean, carrot.
So I just want to follow up on something you mentioned, which was, I agree that if we're going to figure out what it is they want, we also have to understand who they are and what they want and how to reach them. And unfortunately, at this point in time, we're at a point where we have almost no access and there's almost no interaction. Part of that is what we call the New York Channel has been silent to a certain degree. That's the North Korean mission to the UN. Also, we have a travel ban in place on Americans right now for starting in September. It'll be good for at least a year. That prohibits most Americans from traveling to North Korea. So there's so little opportunity for us to really get to know who they are. That's certainly a concern of mine. If we don't know who they are, how do we even know how to punish them or reach out to them? But in terms of a carrot, I'm just going to quickly say, one of the interesting things when Donald Trump was campaigning was that he said, I would sit down with Kim Jong-un and have a hamburger with him. And I have to say it was kind of intriguing. There are reasons why you don't do that, because it really legitimizes the person you're sitting down with, and that's certainly a concern. But I can tell you that that's exactly what Kim Jong-un wants. So it was an intriguing proposal to put out there, and I'm very interested to know if that could ever happen.
A little bit of burger diplomacy, which means legitimacy. Frank, is that a good carrot?
That is a good carrot, and I think, so we know exactly what North Korea wants because they've stated it repeatedly. And I believe at this point the price has probably gone up. So we know that they want to keep their nuclear weapons. They want relief from sanctions. They want an end to U.S. hostile policy, which means end to military exercises, removal of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula. They want economic concessions. So we know what they want. It's just a matter of what are we willing to concede that allows them to get to the table or eventually get the goals that we want.
And a peace treaty, which is part of all of it.
That's a lot. That's a bushel of carrots. I asked for one carrot. You gave me a bushel of carrots. Glenn, one carrot.
Peace treaty.
That's a big carrot. That's a Bugs Bunny sized carrot.
Yeah. Well, you wanted one. You're going to get one. It's a big one.
Yeah. And a peace treaty, just as simple as that, come to the table
to
but it's
negotiate. Congress, you'd be lucky to get one vote in Congress for a peace treaty in North Korea.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is part of the problem. I mean, some of the things they want are impossible to deliver. So let's be realistic. And you have to see it the other way around. Some things the US wants and we want. The European Union would really like North Korea to give a nuclear weapon. We can't get, because you can't deliver some of the things they want. So let's be realistic about, we're going to meet in the middle somewhere. And it seems to me that the US interest is really about stopping them definitively having the ability to hit the mainland USA. Forget about the nuclear weapons, that's gone. That ship sailed. That ship sailed in 2010, I think, which was the last time they mentioned the possibility of getting rid of their nuclear weapons.
Well, another book in your future, Glenn, Impossible Carrots. I already have a title for you. We're going to take another short break of just about a minute or two, and that will give all of you a chance to get your questions ready. The mic will start traveling around the room because you have an opportunity to question these experts yourself, so stay with us.
This is the last?
Yes, last bit coming up.
And is it back?
Also make sure to, when you ask questions, identify yourself,